So often in the church, we either focus on a theology of power or we focus on a theology of pain. There's a large number of churches that are always talking about power. And certainly there's reason to emphasize that God is a God of power and healing and deliverance. But they often have no understanding of a theology of pain. There's other churches that have a well-developed theology of pain and suffering, but they don't understand very much about the power of God. We need both a theology of power and a theology of pain. This is especially important in spiritual formation. That's why today we want to talk about grieving. Grieving the seasons of our life. My starting premise here is that we must grieve the painful losses of the past seasons of our life before we can effectively embrace the present and the future. You see, when things happen to us, when we go through seasons of loss, and it's not just the death of a loved one, it's not just the loss of something that traumatic. Sometimes it can be the loss of dreams, the loss of hopes, the loss of ministry, friends, loved ones, through separation. But the reality is we all go through loss. And in order to embrace our present and our future, we have to grieve these things. The word grieve, or mourn, means to express sorrow. It means that you take what's on the inside and you bring it to the surface. That's the place God can bring healing, and He's designed the grieving process, the mourning process, to bring the kind of freedom from loss and pain and suffering that we so desperately need. Jesus talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, He said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Let me paraphrase what Jesus was saying. Blessed are those who bring what's on the inside out to the surface. Blessed are those who know what it's like to experience loss, pain, suffering, but they don't hold it in, they don't bury it, they bring it out to the surface, they express it, and in the process of doing that, God has designed comfort and healing for those who mourn. I believe this is something all of us need to do, but men, I need to be honest with you, most of the time women are better at this than we are. Years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity to get away for our wedding anniversary. We had a great weekend away, and as we were coming back home, my wife suggested in the car ride that we listen to this tape by a marriage counselor. That should have been my first clue that something was coming that I should have been aware of. And as we listened to this marriage counselor, he began to talk about how men too often fix their wives when they're expressing their sorrow, rather than simply listening to them and allowing them to process. I looked at my wife and I said, what are we supposed to do? When you talk about something that's wrong, that's what men do. We fix it. And my wife shook her head and she said, just listen. This marriage counselor went on to say how men, if your wife is expressing something she's concerned about, rather than trying to fix it, just listen and make the appropriate noises at the appropriate time, letting her know that you're empathizing with her, you're feeling her sorrow, and allow her to express what's going on. And just listen, don't fix. And as I was listening to the marriage counselor, I looked over at my wife, and she was weeping, and she was nodding her head yes. And I realized that I needed to learn something about listening to my wife and helping her grieve when things aren't going well. I also realized I probably need to learn how to grieve myself. Now, some of you are saying, grieving, does this mean that I have to cry? Well, if you're asking that question, you probably could use a good cry. But men, there are other ways we can grieve. We can process, we can get it to the surface, but one way or the other, we need to learn to process that which we've lost. Today I want to focus on 4 important questions about grief, and hopefully I'll provide some answers and we'll walk through the process of how we can do this in a healthy way. The first question I want to look at is a very important question, and that is this. What brings about the need for grief? Why is this even necessary? Well, there's a one-word answer for that: loss. And the truth is, nobody gets out of life without loss. Henry Nouwen puts it this way. It's a long quote, but listen to what he says here. If there is any word that summarizes well our pain, It is the word loss. We have lost so much. Sometimes it seems as if life is just one long series of losses. When we were born, we lost the safety of the womb. When we went to school, we lost the security of our family life. When we got our first job, we lost the freedom of our youth. When we got married or ordained, we lost the joy of many options. And when we grew old, we lost our good looks, our old friends, or our fame. When we became weak or ill, we lost our physical independence. And when we die, we lose it all. And these losses are part of the ordinary life. But whose life is ordinary? The losses that settle themselves deeply in our hearts and minds are the loss of intimacy through separation, the loss of safety through violence, the loss of innocence through abuse, the loss of friends through betrayal, the loss of love through abandonment, the loss of home through war, the loss of well-being through hunger, heat, and cold, and the loss of children through illness or accidents, the loss of country through political upheaval, and the loss of life through earthquakes, floods, plane crashes, bombings, and diseases. Perhaps many of these dark losses are far away from most of us. Maybe they belong to the world of newspapers and television screens, but nobody can escape the agonizing losses that are part of our everyday existence, the loss of our dreams. The bottom line is this: nobody gets out of life without loss. Now, some of you may immediately be thinking, well, I haven't really lost any close loved ones, I haven't gone through the death of a family member, but it's not just those big losses that sidetrack us. In fact, you can make the case that those losses are often given adequate time by the church and by people to allow the grieving process to take place. Sometimes it's the smaller losses, the things that we overlook, that sidetrack us. Let me give you an example. Years ago, when my oldest daughter went off to college, I experienced both celebration but also deep pain. I was very happy for her. I was excited for her. We dropped her off in Philadelphia at her college. But when we were driving back, I cried for 2 hours because I was going to miss her so desperately. I grieved that. And then 2 years later, my only son said that he wanted to go to college in Florida. And I was terrified of an 18-hour drive. And yet, he wanted to go. He wanted to make that drive with his mom and dad to process it. And so we got in the car and we began to drive, and you know what happened? They slept for 12 hours. And so I was driving through North Carolina thinking about taking my only son off to college, grieving while I listened to country music. Country music, music to grieve by. And as I was going through the states, for 18 hours, I cried and I grieved. Now, I grieved both my oldest daughter and my only son going off to college. But when I did that, it birthed a new resolve in me not to miss the last few years of my younger daughter's high school education. And so I prioritized being there at their school events, at their lacrosse games. And see, when you grieve, even good things, the loss of seasons, it births a new resolve in you not to miss the season that's coming. And so loss is something that happens to all of us. In fact, even on a weekly basis, I would suggest that it's part of our Sabbath rest to celebrate the good things that have happened in the week, but also to acknowledge the losses, to express them, to bring them to the surface, and allow the Lord to bring healing on a daily and even a weekly basis. The second question I want to respond to is this: why is grieving necessary? And maybe a better way of putting it would be, what happens if we don't grieve? Well, there's several things that happen. The first thing is that we begin to deaden our hearts. We begin to silence the longing, silence our hopes, silence our dreams, because we begin to think, maybe if I don't hope for so much, when I experience loss, it won't hurt so much. I've seen young people leave college and leave seminary with hopes and dreams of ministry, and after a few years, they go through loss, they go through disappointment, and I see them begin to deaden their hearts and lose their hopes because they haven't adequately grieved the losses that are thrown at them. And so the first thing that happens if we choose not to grieve is we deaden our hearts. The second thing is that we tend to compartmentalize our lives. That means we develop a public life where everything looks fine, everything looks good, but inside we numb our pain with a series of addictions and things that distract us from the losses we've gone through. You see, when we choose not to grieve, our hearts become dead, and we tend to develop this private life, public life, that segments us in a very unhealthy way. Brent Curtis, in his book, The Sacred Romance, puts it like this. Instead of dealing with the arrows, and when he's talking about arrows, he means the lies that attach themselves to our wounds and to our losses. Instead of dealing with the arrows, we silence the longing. That seems to be our only hope, and so we lose heart. For how many losses can a heart take? Let me answer that question in the midst of that quote. I believe if we grieve properly, if we bring our losses to the surface, if we don't hold it in, if we express our sorrow, the comfort of God is sufficient to deal with an infinite number of losses. You see, I don't believe there's any loss that life can give us that our God cannot heal. Brent Curtis goes on and he says, if we deny our wounds or we try to minimize them, we deny a part of our heart, and we end up living with a shallow optimism that frequently becomes a demand that the world be better than it really is. You'll often see Christians that choose not to grieve their losses, but instead just to bury them under a facade of religious cliché and Christianese. And they walk around making true statements. God is good. God can be trusted. But you can tell that they're saying them at a surface level, that their hearts are not convinced of that truth because they haven't experienced the healing and the comfort that can only come as we grieve our sorrows honestly and openly before our God. Brent Curtis goes on and he says there's another group of people. On the other hand, there are some people that allow the losses and the arrows of life to become the final word. And then those things so plunge them into despair that they lose their hope and their heart stops breathing. See, what he's saying is there are some people that never grieve and they never escape their losses. Those losses define them forever. And I suspect some of you know some people that have experienced great loss and not processed it well. And some of you may look at them and say, I could never do this grieving thing because I don't want to end up the way they've ended up. Folks, I want you to know, grieving is not the final destination. Healing is. But we have to go through the valley of tears. We have to go through the valley of sorrows in order to find the victory on the other side that Christ has for us. The third question we want to deal with is this. Why do we avoid the grieving process? I mean, if we all experience loss and we need the healing and the comfort that God brings through it, then why do we avoid it? Well, we don't like pain. The reality is, grieving involves pain. And for some of you, it involves going back to a memory, to a moment that you would rather not remember. But the reality also is that those unhealed memories, those ungrieved losses, leave remnants of pain that affect our life in the present and in the future. And the truth is, if we don't grieve well, we are not going to get free from them. But we don't like the painful process that's involved. I like to think of it like this. I want you to imagine with me that this is what you feel in terms of pain, and this is what you feel in terms of joy. It's like a continuum. And when you go through something that's painful, you begin to say, oh, that hurts, and I'm going to shut down my emotions, and I'm going to move the wall in of what I feel. But the problem is you can't shut down your emotions selectively. And when you begin to move the wall in that allows you to feel pain, you also move the wall in that allows you to experience joy. And so we begin to not feel the pain, but we're not feeling the joy like we used to either. And we live with this monotone existence. You cannot shut down your emotions selectively. It affects the fullness of life when you choose not to grieve. I know we don't enjoy the pain, but the enemy wants to keep you locked up. He wants you to look back at the past and say, I don't want to go there. In fact, if you do go there, you'll never get out. The tears will be too much. But folks, that's a lie. And as you begin to take the wall down and say, Lord, I'll go there with you. I'll feel that pain of that past grief, that past memory. Then he begins to tear the wall down and allow you to experience new joy, even in the midst of the mourning as well. The truth is, joy really does come in the morning. M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. The fourth and final question I'd like us to deal with is this. With what options does our past pain leave us? Now, most of you have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief, anger, denial, rationalization. But I'm not talking about the stages, going through them in a temporary way. I'm talking about camping out there and living there for a long-term season. Well, here are the options. The first thing you can choose to do with your grief, with your pain, with your loss, is live in hiding or denial. But the problem with that is that it's like pushing a beach ball down underneath the water. When you push a beach ball down underneath the water, it comes up somewhere. It doesn't always come up where you push it down, but when you live in hiding, when you live in denial, and you push down the loss, the pain that you've gone through, it's going to affect you somewhere. It'll affect you in other relationships that have nothing to do with the pain or the loss. So hiding or denial is not a good option. The second option is rationalization. We look at other people and what they've gone through, what they've lost, their pain, and we say, what right do I have to grieve my pain when they've lost so much more than I have? But the problem is, your pain is still your pain. It's still affecting you, and it's affecting the people around you. In fact, if you choose not to deal with your past pain, you won't be able to help those who have lost far more than you have. The third option is anger and bitterness. This is actually a very popular option in American culture because anger is readily available. It's a painkiller. We can easily go to the anger and bitterness, but the problem is bitterness is the poison we ingest hoping it will hurt someone else. I know that anger makes you feel like you're in control. It makes you feel like you're not the victim, but that's not a long-term solution to the losses of your life. Grieving, bringing them to the surface, allowing the Lord to heal them, that's the real answer. The fourth option is addictions. People can use all manner of things to numb their pain. Alcohol, drugs, workaholism, even religious activity. But the problem is, numbing the pain doesn't deal with the pain. Numbing the pain doesn't bring you to a place of healing. And so none of these options we've talked about are really the kind of option we want to choose. The best option is biblical grief and mourning. Henry Nouwen puts it this way: yes, we must mourn our losses. We cannot talk or act them away, but we can shed tears over them and allow ourselves to grieve deeply. To grieve is to allow our losses to tear apart our feelings of security and safety and lead us to the painful truth of our brokenness. Let me pause there for a minute. Some of you may say, why would I want to tear apart my feelings of safety and security? The truth is, when we build feelings of safety and security for ourselves, it's an illusion. It's a facade. The only place we find true safety, true security, is when we can come to Jesus and say, in all of my brokenness, Lord, would you bring healing? Would you bring comfort? And we express the sorrows and the losses, and we experience His safety and His security. Nouwen goes on and he says, but in the midst of all this pain, there is a strange yet very surprising voice of the one who says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. That's the unexpected news. That's the blessing hidden in our grief. Not those who comfort are blessed, but those who mourn. And somehow in the midst of our tears, a gift is hidden. Somehow in the midst of our mourning, the first steps of the dance takes place. Somehow the cries that well up from our losses belong to our songs of gratitude. The truth is, joy really does come in the mourning, mourning. In order to grieve your past pain, you must get in touch with that which you've lost. You have to go there. I know it's painful, but the reality is you need to go there with people who you trust that can help God bring the comfort that you need to set you free. Years ago, I was speaking at a Christian conference on the subject of loss. I was preaching from the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is an interesting book because it's really Jeremiah's grief journal. Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we have recorded a prophet's grief over the loss of his beloved city of Jerusalem. He learns to grieve in a very powerful way. At the end of my sermon, a woman in her late 60s came running forward to the altar. She was weeping, and her husband followed her. As soon as I could, my wife and I made our way over to this older couple, and we found out that she was grieving a loss that had happened over 40 years ago. In their first pastorate, this pastor's wife had lost their first baby. In the midst of her grieving the loss of this child, the women of the church were very nice. They came over, they made meals for her. It was on a Wednesday that she lost the baby, and on Thursday they were there at her house, and after they had prayed with her, they were leaving, and they said, now we will see you on church on Sunday, won't we? Because no one can play the piano except you, and no one can teach the Sunday school class that you're scheduled to teach but you. And it was in that moment that that woman realized she only had 2 or 3 days to grieve the loss of her child. And so she began to swallow her pain, bury her loss, and move on in ministry. Now, 40 years later, at a church conference, God began to put His finger on a loss that was long overdue, tears that were long overdue. And as she grieved and as she cried that week, we helped her process the pain of that loss from 40 years ago. They named that child for the first time in 40 years. We actually had a little service remembering that child that had gone on to heaven before them. And that woman told us that God brought her incredible comfort and freedom like she hadn't had in over 40 years. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. For your group time today, I want to suggest that you begin the process of doing a grief journal. In the class I teach at Alliance Theological Seminary and Nyack College, when we do this course, we ask the students to do a 7 to 10 page grief journal, highlighting the significant losses of their life that have impacted them and affected them. We do this so they can bring it to the surface in a healthy way. Well, I would suggest that you start a similar process. You may not do a paper for a college course, but I would suggest you start with a bullet list of your losses. Just begin to write down things that God is bringing to your memory. Painful moments, painful seasons, the loss of your dreams, the loss of your hopes, where life has not gone the way you thought it would. And you can either start chronologically with those losses or wherever the most pain arises. But my advice to you is that don't stop when it starts to get uncomfortable or painful. That's often a sign that there's infection underneath the scab, that you really do need to go there, that you're not as healed as you thought you were in that area. In fact, sometimes it's like peeling an onion. The Lord asks you to go to a new level of the onion, and the tears begin all over again. I would also suggest that you find a safe person to help you process. Not everyone is safe, I understand that, but hopefully the people in your group or your Sunday school class or wherever you're watching this video can help you to listen and not fix you and really weep with you as you weep through these seasons of your life. And so as you begin this process, there's really no wrong way to do it. I don't want you to hold back. I don't want you to censor. You're allowed to be real here and not just right, because you're never going to receive the healing that you need from the Lord until you get honest, until you grieve the seasons of your life. You may want to make this a regular spiritual discipline. I would suggest that as part of your weekly Sabbath rest, you celebrate the joys of the week and then also grieve some of the losses that have come up. It's best to do it while it's still fresh in your mind, while you can bring it to the Lord and grieve that which you've lost. And in the process, you will discover, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.